Welcome to Introduction to Science Policy. In this module, you will learn terms and concepts that introduce you to the wide world of science policy. We start with a standard model of science policy interface, which looks a lot like the Berlin Wall. Unfortunately, what we have are two communities that come together at an interface that appears to be a major barrier to interrelationships across these two communities. Often it feels like we're sort of lobbing hand grenades over the wall at each other. And so what we need to do is break down this barrier to develop a much tighter integration and relationship between the science and policy communities. We need a different model. Basically, what we're looking for is to develop knowledge brokers who have a foot in both camps and who can communicate across the divide between these two worlds. So what are we talking about? First of all, we're defining science very broadly and inclusively to include the natural, health, social sciences, humanities, engineering, and technology. Basically, the knowledge disciplines. Policy also is defined quite inclusively, and I like to use this quote that makes clear that policy is not just about priorities and strategies and objectives of a government. It also includes the beliefs, principles, values, and actions. It provides a bit of a roadmap, but because it includes these subjective things like beliefs and values, it can be difficult for the scientific community to understand how to navigate in this world because science tends to see itself as very objective. And finally, integration. When we talk about the integration of science and policy, we're deliberately choosing integration over the term interface to achieve a greater blending of science and policy, to unite the two into a better whole. This can be a bit controversial, particularly for the science side, because we tend to see policy as a messy world that we're not sure we want to get into, and we want to keep the science pure. However, if we're going to achieve effective science policy integration and evidence-based decision-making, integration is the goal that we are seeking. So there are two major strands to science policy. This is a fundamental distinction that we use in science policy, and it's important to understand these two aspects or these two sides of the science policy coin. On one side, we have what's called policy for science. It's concerned with the government or the society's policies related to the management and support of the scientific enterprise. And on the other side of the coin, we have what's called science for policy, which is concerned with how we use the insights and knowledge and methods from science and engineering to inform other areas of public policy where such insights can help shape sensible policies. And so on the one hand, you have policy for science, which is in a lot of ways similar to any other public policy area, whether it's health policy or environmental policy, defense policy. It's basically what's the government's plan for how to support this particular area. Science for policy gets at that idea of using the evidence that comes from scientific knowledge to inform broader areas of public policy. So let's just drill down a little bit further into this distinction because it is such an important one. So if you're working more on the policy for science side of this coin, these would be some of the types of questions you might grapple with. What needs do we have for science, technology, and innovation? How should those needs be resourced? What personnel do we need? For example, does Canada need more PhD scientists? Do we need more technicians? What institutional arrangements are most conducive to advancing scientific research? Should we be putting more funding into universities, into the private sector, into government labs, for example? And then finally, things like what values should guide the profession? So whether we're talking about the use of research animals or human subjects in research, plagiarism, all of the ethical guidelines that guide scientific research are also part of policy for science. On the other side of the coin, again, we have science for policy. And so if you're, again, working more in this area, you'd be asking types of questions like, how can the results of science inform policy decisions? What should count as evidence? How can the methods, not only the knowledge, but how can the methods of science, technology, and innovation inform decision processes? And here an example would be risk analysis. which obviously emerged out of the technical disciplines, but is now used quite broadly in government to help guide decision making. Science for Policy also gets into the science advisory relationship and the idea that we have science advisors and we have decision makers, and what's the appropriate relationship between them. So, for example, in Canada, we now have a chief science advisor who advises the Prime Minister on science. What's that relationship like? How does that work most effectively? What other mechanisms are there for bringing scientific evidence to policy? All of these types of questions would be on the Science for Policy side. So now we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into policy for science, and then later in the module we'll look at science for policy. So on the policy for science side, again, we're basically asking what is the government's plan to manage the scientific community, to provide resources for it, and to guide it. And if we step back and say, well, why should we even care about science and technology? Why does a government feel the need for a science policy? There are many reasons. I think chief among them is what we would call the economic rationale. This is the one that you most often hear argued by politicians in terms of why a government is supporting research. And that's the idea that science leads to technology, which then generates innovation. Innovation in the private sector particularly leads to greater productivity and competitiveness and growth, and on up this sort of stairway to a better quality of life. And so the idea is we invest in science and technology because we think it will drive the economy forward and ultimately provide a higher quality of life. However, it's also important to realize that science, technology, and innovation are not just about economic growth. And in fact, this is a declaration from a few years ago that made very clear that innovation can do more than just drive strong economic growth. It has the potential to solve the big challenges that we face as Canadians. And so there's also a public policy rationale of getting at those grand challenges that we face. This is from a 3M survey that asked people what issues they want science to help solve. Not surprisingly, things like healthcare, climate change, clean energy score very high. So again, we have a policy for science in order to make sure that science is helping to guide and address these grand societal challenges. There's also an interest in having a policy for science and technology because of the technologies that we see emerging at a very rapid pace and creating both positive and negative implications for society. So this is a collection of a number of different emerging technologies. They're grouped by these various bubbles around robotics and AI, cognitive technologies, information technologies, etc. And what we're also seeing is a greater convergence of these. And so, for example, you can think about information technologies and biotechnologies coming together to provide faster sequencing of the genome and reducing the cost of that kind of research. And so from a science policy perspective, the question then is, can we have a policy for science that helps advance these technologies? Again, from an economic point of view, we want these technologies to spur economic growth. But there's also the flip side of that, which is we want to make sure that we're regulating these technologies in the public interest to ensure that Canadians are safe. And so a good question for science policy is, are we ready for these technologies that are emerging? Do we have a good handle on how to regulate them in the public interest? A few other reasons for why we need a science policy or why we need policy for science. One is just the fact that we spend a lot of money on science. So, for example, in 2023, Canada as a country spent about $49 billion on research and development. The federal government itself spent over $15 billion on science and technology, which represents about 3% of the total annual federal budget. And so it's not an insignificant spend. And because of this, we want to make sure that we have a strategy or a policy that helps guide that spending. And then finally, you can think of a cultural rationale, which is the idea that we pursue science to advance our knowledge and understanding of our place in the universe. We can use it to combat ignorance and superstition and prejudice. And we also see that science contributes concepts, metaphors. So there's even an aesthetic rationale for the fact that science helps advance our culture and our art. Now, this is not typically the rationale that you will most often hear from politicians in terms of why we're spending those large numbers of dollars. Again, it's usually the economic rationale that is used to justify that expenditure. But nonetheless, all of these rationales or all of these reasons are fundamental to why we have a science policy. Now, what does the society think about all of this? So this is taken from the Edelman Trust Barometer a few years ago. We find that nearly 2/3 of the respondents do not have confidence that our current leaders will be able to successfully address our challenges, which is concerning. And then when you break that down by groups, you find that science and scientists actually do quite well on these types of surveys. So 83% of those responding had trust in scientists, and that compares quite favorably to business leaders and politicians who are down at 42%. So this is generally quite positive, that science enjoys a high level of trust from society. However, there are still some signs of concern. In that 3M survey, we see that 58% think that scientists are elitist, and nearly half believe that scientists are not as ethical as they should be. So while we enjoy a strong degree of trust from society generally, there are some warning signs out there that we need to be thinking about, because to the extent that there's a decline in trust in institutions, and particularly institutions of authority that are seen as elitist, to the extent that then the public sees scientists as elites and perhaps unethical, this can create concerns about the relationship with society. Okay, now we'll shift our attention to the science for policy side of the coin. So many years ago in 2012, we saw a march on Parliament Hill by academic scientists and government scientists who were bemoaning what they called the death of evidence in that time period. The government at the time was accused of muzzling scientists, not allowing them to speak at conferences, particularly on controversial topics such as climate change. And it created a moment that we hadn't seen before, where the scientific community in Canada became quite politically engaged and was advocating for the role of science and evidence in decision making. We fast forward then to 2015, and during that election cycle, both the NDP and Liberal parties made science a key part of their agendas, their platforms. When the Liberals got elected, they came in and made very clear that they wanted policy to be based on evidence. The Prime Minister was quoted as saying that scientific knowledge should inform decision-making. And so all of these signals were good, that science was back, that science was going to play an important role in the government decision-making. However, I think it's always important to remember this quote from the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, that there's nothing a government hates more than to be well informed, because it makes the process of arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult. So a government can be for scientific evidence until they're not. But often when the scientific evidence goes against a decision that they're hoping to make, they can suddenly be a lot less supportive of the scientific evidence. And so it's important to remember that the importance placed on science and science policy integration can vary over time. It's also important to remember that if we're going to be successful at integrating science and policy, both of these communities need to take ownership and responsibility for making this happen. It's too easy for say the policy side to say, well, we're happy to integrate the scientific evidence if only these scientists could help explain, what the evidence is. They don't really speak in plain language. It's really hard to grasp the implications of their evidence. Or the science side might say, well, we're happy to have the policy side take up our evidence into decision making. We publish our results in academic journals that are freely available to the policy world, and so why is integration a problem? There should be no problem. And of course, neither of those arguments really hold, but it makes it easy for either side to just say it's the other side's responsibility to deal with this. If we're going to be successful, both sides need to take responsibility. I also think a key message is that in order for this to work well, the integration of science and policy can't occur only when a decision is needed. It needs to be based on early and ongoing interactions between these two communities. And that leads to our third key message, which is relationships are key. And so building a relationship between these two worlds is what it's all about. I like to use this joke just to illustrate some of the challenges that we have in building that trusted relationship. So a guy in a hot air balloon gets lost, descends to ask for directions. A woman on the ground shouts back precise latitude, longitude, and altitude information. That guy in the balloon says, you must be a scientist. I ask you a simple question, you provide me way too much information, and I'm still lost. And to which she responds then, well, you must be a policy analyst. You came out of nowhere with your question. I gave you the most accurate answer I could. You're still lost, and you blame me. I think it just illustrates some of the cultural barriers that we have to overcome. So let's explore those a little bit. So this is drawn from a famous lecture by this gentleman, C.P. Snow, who gave a lecture at Harvard in, I believe, 1960 about the two cultures. And it does help illustrate some of the barriers that we're dealing with in terms of bringing these two cultures together. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but for example, the time horizon is a very big one. In science, we're used to dealing with research that takes months, sometimes years, sometimes even longer. The policy cycle is much shorter. At most, you're looking at sort of the 4-year cycle of a mandate before a government has to go back to the polls. So they want to be able to show things, show progress in a fairly short time period, and often decisions are being made, months, weeks, sometimes days, sometimes hours. And so there is a fundamental difference where the time horizons of these two communities is quite different, and that can present a bit of a challenge to integrating evidence. Similarly, as we've already alluded to, we use different languages. So science obviously seeks precision, uses very technical jargon. Policy prefers a bit more flexibility, and they also have a jargon. We often blame the scientists for not speaking in plain language, but also the political level has a jargon that can be hard to understand if you're not part of that world. We have different levels of comfort with uncertainty. Obviously, in science, we're dealing with uncertainty all the time. We have ways of measuring that and conveying that. The policy world tends to be much less comfortable with that and may just demand what is the answer, what is the evidence. We also, I'll skip down to transparency. This is another one where, of course, at least in the academic world, we're trained to make our science open. We publish it to make it available to others. In the policy world, as much as we talk about transparency and openness, the process is often quite closed. You can think about, for example, cabinet at the federal level, which meets behind closed doors. We don't know what's on the agenda. We don't see minutes. It's very difficult to know whether science was brought to the table to inform a decision. So this is also a challenge. And then finally, things like location. So science, of course, is everywhere. It's not just in Ottawa, whereas policy does tend to be a headquarters function, if you will. And so there can be just a geographic divide in terms of where the science is versus where policy is done. So these are all reasons why it can be very difficult and challenging to integrate science and policy, but we shouldn't use these as an excuse to not try. I think where there's a will, there's a way, and we need to figure out how to overcome these barriers in order to effectively integrate science and policy. So let's look at how that might happen. we start with a very simplistic model, which turns out to be not very sophisticated. And that is, again, this idea that science is out there producing evidence. It's kind of this beacon of truth, putting the evidence into the public domain. And so from this perspective, there's no real issue. And we know that this is overly simplistic, if for no other reason because the policy world doesn't have the time to read the scientific journals, and even if they did, they probably wouldn't understand most of it, because again, that technical jargon that we use in scientific communication. So we shift to a slightly more sophisticated perspective, which is to think about the decision maker and think about how science can inform the decision maker and then hopefully inform the policy decision that emerges. This is also a little too simplistic, but it does seem to resonate with some of the thinking when we use terms like evidence-based decision-making. It does seem to be the case that we're thinking that as long as science can get the ear of the decision maker, that evidence will determine what the policy decision is. And again, this is a little overly simplistic for one reason, because science doesn't speak with one voice. On any public policy issue of any sort of magnitude, you're going to need input from various aspects of science, various disciplines, and so this can be a challenge. But even more importantly, of course, is that science is not the only input to policy decision making. A decision maker needs to consider political implications, economic, potentially legal, if it's an international issue, diplomatic, social, cultural implications, etc. And so there are many inputs to a decision, and science being only one of those. Now, this is where most of the literature stops, but I think even this doesn't go far enough to explain the challenge, because these days it's rare that there's a single decision maker. You usually have multiple decision makers, and again, cabinet would be an example of that. And secondly, I don't think that each of these decision makers necessarily ticks down through this list of considerations when making a decision, but typically they'll come to a decision table with different lenses or different preferences, and advancing those preferences in order to influence the decision. And so in this context, you hope that there is somebody who is bringing the scientific perspective to that decision-making table. But again, it's a much messier model than what we started out with. So then let's shift to what is perhaps a final perspective on how we can integrate science and policy, and that is taking more of an issue-centric perspective. And if you talk to many people who work in the policy world, they do seem to think that it's very much an issue-driven world. So an issue arises and comes into the decision-making world, and depending on how it gets treated in that analytical space, you get different decisions or different impacts out the other side. So this is not unlike light coming into a prism, and then depending on the aspects of that prism, you will get bending of the light out the other side. So then, what is it about the prism that makes the decision here or influences the decision? So you can see here a series of words starting with I, ideas, information, instruments, interests, etc. But in this model, you don't see explicitly the word science, and this can be a bit disconcerting, because if this is how policy tends to work, that it's issue-driven and it comes into this decision-making system that doesn't seem to explicitly acknowledge science, how do we deal with that? Well, so I think it is true that science is not, we shouldn't take for granted that science is going to be considered. And I think it's puts a bit of responsibility on the scientific community to help figure out how they can influence these variables with science. So, ideas, information. Can science provide new knowledge, new data that helps inform the decision? instruments? Can we provide new technologies that might allow for a new way of delivering a policy? Can we work through institutions and individuals, and can we understand the various interests at play and influence the system through those means rather than expecting that science will necessarily be explicitly considered? So then how do we make sure that we understand what the priorities of the government are and how we might influence those with our scientific evidence? So these are just a few of the ways that we can get clues as to where the government is focused. Obviously, before an election, parties will develop platforms that will signal what they hope to do if they become government. Once in government, they will issue a speech from the throne, which is basically an outline of their agenda. Every year, they will issue a federal budget, which indicates where they want to put their funding. Another way to understand the priorities of government is to look at the mandate letters that the Prime Minister issues to the ministers. And then, of course, there are emerging developments because despite the best planning of any government, things happen that they did not count on. For example, during the election in 2019, no one would have thought that a few months later we'd be hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, just looking at the speeches of ministers and the Prime Minister and what's happening, in the media gives you a clue of where the government is putting its priorities and where you might be able to have your science influence decision making. So to wrap up, I wanted to stress once again that I don't think we can be successful at the integration of science and policy by waiting for a decision and then quickly thinking, oh, let's determine what science evidence there is to inform this decision. Rather, what we need, as I indicated earlier, is a lot of early and ongoing interactions between the policy stream and science stream, so that hopefully we get to a point where instead of two parallel streams that aren't intersecting, we get to a point where policy is helping to guide the research agenda, research is helping to guide the policy agenda, and we have a nice virtuous circle of policy informing science, science informing policy, and hopefully for a better result. Thank you.